Thank you. Yes, so, okay, I feel a bit embarrassed as the first speaker at this conference. Thanks a lot for allowing me to be here. I had a wonderful time now 2 years ago, 2019, at the ICTS. It was amazing. I hope I can come again in presence, not on Zoom. But okay, for now, we are here. So, okay. Basically, I'm gonna, okay, since this is also the first talk is, I hope it will be a bit introductory about the topic, which is anyway mostly hydrodynamic approaches to interacting systems. Especially the main focus is on quantum system, quantum many-body systems. But of course, it also applies to lots of classical many-body system, and mostly in 1+1 dimension. And okay, and if everything goes well, basically the idea is to also show how this hydrodynamic approach can also be used to understand how system thermalize due to interactions from an hydrodynamic point of view. Okay, so starting really like very broad. Let's say that now in the past like 10-15 years, lots of effort in theoretical experimental physics, and especially in quantum many-body physics, has been on understanding how basically how isolated quantum systems behave when they are non-equilibrium, which in a sense it's like a master one problem. Like given a quantum state, we know that its evolution is just given by unitary time evolution for any, if you have like some Hamiltonian system. But this is still it's a remarkably difficult problem, because even if we know how to solve Schrödinger equation, when there are a large number of elementary constituents, we don't know how to actually write down even a physical observer, like expectation value of local operators on a many-body states, especially when the time evolved, because usually the complexity of the objects is too large to be tackled either by numerical or theoretical methods. But in a sense, why would we want to do that? I mean, is this an academic question? Of course not. Our experimentalist friends are doing this now successfully, and maybe even better than theoretical approaches, really using, really probing nature, like probing dynamics of quantum systems, isolated from most of external interactions. And one maybe most successful example of this is really our experimentalist friends in the fields of cold atoms. Nowadays, they can really isolate atoms and bring them to a temperature where quantum effects are relevant, and even study their non-equilibrium dynamics, which means that they can really initialize the system in some more or less quantum state. Maybe it's not going to be exactly pure, but and then let it evolve by its own Hamiltonian. And okay, this experiment nowadays has been shown probably in any slide in the field of non-equilibrium quantum dynamics, but is still there to say that it all started a bit. What are the questions that in a sense inspire our field? And this was 2006, so in a sense a long time ago. There in the quantum neutral cradle, the experimentalists prepared a gas of cold atoms in a quasi one-dimensional trap, and they initialize, and basically at time 0 they gave some pulse to this gas such that alpha the gas was going in one direction and alpha the gas was going in another, had momentum in the other direction, and basically this gas was oscillating in an harmonic trap. And after many collisions, they were seeing that this gas was failing to thermalize. So in a sense, the momentum distribution function was still conserving a high, strong memory of the initial partition to peak of momentum. And this started out the question, like, why should we actually even see thermalization in an isolated system? Do we need always some external beds? Or if we can, if in a sense a macroscopic system isolated is expected to thermalize, should we expect some deviation if the system is on one dimension, and if the system is close to a specific point of which are called integrable points? And this will be indeed like one of the main focus of this talk. Indeed, there is a class of many-body systems, and mostly in 1+1 dimension, that are called quantum, but not integrable models, integrable systems. There are also classical integrable systems. Quantum are just their generalization. An example of them is a well-known Lieb-Lininger model. This was model solved for the first time in the 60s, and it's a model for a bosonic many-body system interacting with point contact repulsion or also attraction, doesn't matter, where C is the coupling between the atoms. And this is just one example. There are many quantum integrable systems. They somehow, for me, I like to think them as like points in the, if you think like, if you consider like this possibly continuous, well, no one really knows, universe of many-body interacting system. Integrable systems are just points. They are not, they don't cover the full, of course, set of interacting systems. They're just points. They live in this like space of many-body system with local interaction at least. And they all share the same feature, that basically there is some, you can at least write down their eigenfunctions, and their eigenfunctions are called beta wave functions. Beta wave functions are a class of wave functions which are basically always take the form of, they can always be written in terms of a set of complex parameter, which can be thought as effective momenta of the system indicated with theta, and usually the beta wave function take care of all possible permutation of this momenta between the elementary constituents of our system. In this case, for example, if you have bosons, each there is an effective momenta to which you can think of a boson, and the beta wave function basically permute all these momenta between these bosons. And but despite the fact that we can write it down, it's still a very complex object, because if you think of this is like some factorial permutation, so it's still impossible to write down for a large number of particles, and very hard to do calculation with them. So we know in classical physics this is an approach which is called hydrodynamics, which indeed tell us that even if we have a system of interacting particles that undergo like some chaotic scattering and complicated nonlinear dynamics, at least at large scale we can extract some universal law that takes really simple shape. One example is the fixed law of diffusion, that we know that if you have some space unbalance in the system a large time, this space unbalance, this density unbalance, for example, will relax with a very simple law, which is diffusion law. And the whole bridge between the macroscopic dynamics and what we see is in this parameter, which is an effective parameter in non-equilibrium physics, the diffusion constant. So basically what was asked now 5 years ago was really how to also do a coarse graining of the beta wave function in order to have a more handy description of the dynamics of quantum, but also classical integrable system. And maybe this would be also a way to go beyond these points, to also understand what's around these points, how the physics is around these points, because once you have a picture, an dynamic description, it will be also more easy to deform it. Okay, so there's this question. That's what started with the whole business of GHD, which is an acronym for Generalized Hydrodynamics. That was started in the I like to think that this as in a sense the founding papers, but the dots basically indicate the fact that nowadays there are like over 100 of papers on the subject, and now it's kind of a well-established field. And that still has some surprise from time to time. So you will listen to many talks on this week on generalized dynamics. So I hope for the people that are not familiar with that will gain some understanding later on this. So the first part of the talk will be to a bit like give a bit of rigorous or like precise understanding of what does it mean to extract an hydrodynamic of a system. And this is something that we recently redid this year in order to understand a more complicated case of an homogeneous Hamiltonian that I will talk later. But okay, basically the idea is that we have a system with a set of local conserved quantities, which means that conserved quantities can be written as some or integral of some densities, which these can be operator. In our case, are operators that act non-trivially only on some region of the system. All these conserved quantities all commute with each other, and we want to basically write down an equation for these densities, which is basically a continuity equation for this density of conserved quantities. So to each density, there is a current associated to it. So I will denote the conserved quantities. Now, I can be a generic index, can be 1 or 2, but even infinity. So the main point is that we want to take expectation values of these operators on hydrodynamic scales. So at some position x0, at some time t0. So what's the main idea of hydrodynamic is that basically, okay, we have, for example, some initial state, we let it evolve a large time. And the first assumption that we do is some separation of the system into some kind of locked fluid cells. Locked fluid cell means that on some macroscopic scale, we can think the state basically heavily the off-diagonal terms, if you want, of the density the metrics are 0, and we can basically do some spatial modulation of the density metrics in terms of our local densities. Basically, we can think that locally there is some kind of Gibbs ensemble describing the system, but also modulation of, because these chemical potential, we should not think them as completely flat. They could also be modulated. For example, the first correction would be some linear slope in for the density for the chemical potential in our system. So once this is the first assumption, and the second assumption is basically that the expectation value of operators locally will relax at equilibrium. Namely, it means that, for example, if we want the expectation value of our current at some position x0 t0, this is not exactly like saying that this is the expectation value of the current on such a state, but we also have to take some large time limit of this object because we want this to relax. This is not a stationary state, so we want first to relax, and also express this in terms of our hydrodynamic variable, because eventually we want a closed equation for our hydrodynamic variables. So what are hydrodynamic variables here? Basically, here are the expectation value of the charges. So our charges, we denote them like this. These are, now it's a field. It's a field that for any I tell us what's the expectation value of the charges at position x and t. And what we want to do is to express the expectation value of our currents, which in general we don't know, so that's the whole point of hydrodynamics, in terms assuming this type of spatial modulation for our states and express in terms of this hydrodynamic variable. So the logic is to first expand in each fluid cell these expectation values, express them in terms of hydrodynamic variable, and then take basically some large time limit that you need to make operator to relax to equilibrium. So how do we do it? For example, what we have for example, such a state, and we want to compute the expectation value of some charge at some position, for example, 0 and time 0. On such a state, we can just do an expansion, like perturbative expansion of such expectation value on a state. So we have the first term, which is just if you want, like the stationary state, and the second term, due to the fact that we have some slope in the system. Notice that now we are truncating just to the first term, but in principle, we could go to higher terms. This is all what we need to do if we want to compute an hydrodynamic up to second order. And basically, when we do that, we notice that quantities like the charges, but also the currents, diverge in time. Diverge in time because indeed we have a slope in our system, and it means once we have a slope, it means that basically is a flux of charges. There is a current produced by the slope. So this it's a bit contradictory because we will think eventually we need an equation which is well defined in the large time limit. But everything is fine because even when we expand our current operator on this state, basically we also have a correction that diverges in time. But what we have to remember is always to express, we need to express our expectation value of the current in terms of our real hydrodynamic variables. Namely, these are hydrodynamic variables and not this one, not the one expanded on this state. So basically, we have to express, for example, this current, which now is a function of the charges on this stationary state, in terms of the real hydrodynamic variable. Namely, we have to shift back the expectation value of the currents by the correction that we find in the charges. So this gives us a corrected term that also diverges in time, and eventually we find an expression for the current which has a well-defined large time limit. And this actually integral over time of the projection, basically of the current on all the other currents is, once we take the large time limit, is what really gives us the Onsager matrix. Onsager matrix is basically, or if you want, the current correlation is really what gives us information about the diffusion present in our system. So eventually, the equation that we find, it's a very standard hydrodynamic equation where the time derivative, time evolution of our hydrodynamic variable, our field of charges, is given by the divergence of a current, and this is our Euler current, namely the current that we see at Euler scale, and this is the term given by, if you want, the first term in the expansion of our hydrodynamic state. And the second term given by the expansion is a second order correction, second order in space. If you want, this is a second order in derivative, 1 over x squared. Indeed, it's that proportional to the slope of our chemical potential. And this coefficient is given by the Onsager matrix, which is this object. It's the current correlator in our system. So this is an equation, this is an dynamic equation at the second, that is valid at the second order in 1 over space square. And of course, yes, we can always relate the slope in chemical potential to the slope in charge via the susceptibility matrix, but that's detail. Anyway, so this is very generic. I just re-derived, if you want, hydrodynamics for generic set of quantities in one dimension. I could do the same in any dimension, nothing would change. Probably many of you knew already how to do this, but we had somehow, we felt that we had to written down this, we couldn't find this written down anywhere. If we restrict now to integrable systems, we actually, this equation can be written for integrable system, in a different fashion, but it's still the same equation, because the power of integrable system is now for, instead of using the basis of conserved quantities, we can use a basis of quasi-particles. Basically, in integrable system, I have an infinite number of conserved quantities. So this I now goes from 1 to infinity. And for each of them, there is an associated conserved quantity that's measure, if you want, some density of quasi-particles. The density for the theta, the theta is the initial quasi-particle in the system, and if the density is a position x and t, there will be a density of quasi-particle position x and t. And so if you want, like, the density of charges are like the moments associated to this density. We can also associate a filling, which is just this density divided by their momenta. It's just a different parameterization. The Euler currents are easily computed, and that was the result of 2016 hydrodynamics, basically. And it takes and you see that the reason why it's simpler to work with densities, because everything become a bit like standard physics of fluid. You have like, if you have a density, its current is the density times the time of velocity. This velocity, although it's a function of the density, because there is like a relation between, there is a fluid relation between the density and the velocity. And this goes through what an integrable model is called dressing. Basically, because the system is interacting, but interacting in a very specific way. Basically, when we take a particle and we throw it and we let it go through the system, every time we find another particle, there will be some phase shift. The phase shift is this function t. Basically, what eventually at the end, this particle will be dressed by the interaction with all the other one, by multiple scattering with all the particles in the system. That's why the dressing is an operation, is the linear operator that basically adds all the contribution to scattering with events. Usually in interactive system, this is something that one can only compute perturbatively, but the integrable model, this series actually can be resummed to an linear operator. And the effective velocity basically is the effect of the dressing, that this particle is moving with some bare velocity, but after that has flow into the system with many scattering, its velocity is basically renormalized. But nevertheless can be computed, and it's a nonlinear function of the density. And using this property, we can also express the diffusion, the Onsager matrix, as a bilinear operator, not a linear operator, but a bilinear operator. And in terms of this,
so sorry, Jacopo.
Yes.
So there was a question in the chat from 3D. Can you check?
I don't think I can. How do I see Zoom? I'm now lost everything. Because I'm full screen.
Can you see? I can read.
Yes, can you read? Because I cannot. Okay.
So in the expansion to arrive at the hydrodynamic current, what justifies to stop at second order? I guess there is a large scale in which the higher terms are subleading. What is this scale in your analysis? That's the question from 3D.
Yes, very good. The scale is always the scale of variation of the basically of our fluids. We have to assume that all constant quantities vary smoothly in X, and basically that we only care about basically this order. There is no reason why this series actually can be truncated, and indeed, like in standard hydrodynamics, in many cases, this series actually diverge, as far as I know. Basically, like in Navier-Stokes equation, you only include second order because that's what are responsible for a number of features, for example, like thermalization, we see later. But in general, yes, one should go also to higher orders, yes. Okay, so, and indeed, these diffusive terms that are indeed the second order terms basically take into account the fact that in our system, the velocity is not, it has a mean value, which is the effective velocity, but it also has fluctuations due to the fact that anyway, there are lots of scattering going around in the system. And therefore, it fluctuates, and it fluctuates usually with some Gaussian profile, and that's why you have basically some diffusion spreading of the quasi-particle. So I will write here, indeed, this is like the generalized hydrodynamic equation that the first part was written in 2016, and basically it's equivalent to a Euler equation for this quasi-particle, and it's just so the density of this quasi-particle that basically just have some convective flow, and convective flow is given by the effective velocity times the density. And in 2018, there was added this term that indeed also takes into account the fact that this convective flow also has diffusive spreading around. And you will see there will be other talks about this. There are a lot of interesting physical features due to this term. For example, people have used it to compute auto, like the spreading of auto-time correlations. People that have used it to also to check when does this term diverge, namely when you can have super diffusion. This would be the talk of Enei and Romain. Rederive terms that is now known since a few years, but in a bit more at least for me, clear fashion. So why we arrive to this? As the question asked, indeed, there will be higher terms if we include higher terms in our expansion of the state. What I want to do now is, so far this is for an Hamiltonian which is independent of space. It's some global Hamiltonian, and the only special variation is in the state. But we know that a lot of interesting physical settings nowadays have also Hamiltonians that depends on space. For example, this is an atom chips, is what experimentally used to confine cold atoms, and usually they have some external potential that confine atoms, for example, and this means that on top of the linear Hamiltonian, you should put some potential coupling to the density. Or, for example, nowadays, people are interested in, for example, a system like Fermi-Hubbard model, where particles jump on some lattice, but also you can put some electric field or magnetic field that give some slope to the particles. And these are all examples where the Hamiltonian indeed is space dependent. And to be more precise, basically, now on top of these conserved quantities, that we have written, we write the Hamiltonian as some sum of densities with some function v of x that basically give us the spatial profile Hamiltonian. Notice that not all of them should be space dependent. Some of them can be constant. But nevertheless, we take this generic form. And for example, for the linear, the density here would be flat for the energy, but would be space dependent for the density. Okay, so this is density. How to incorporate this effect? It's known at Euler scale from since 2017. Basically, the external, this space dependent give some forces to the system. These forces, usually as used in hydrodynamics, they give some acceleration to the quasi-particle. Namely, now the time dependence is not just given by the convective flow, but it's also given by some derivative in momentum that indeed should be seen as an acceleration. And there is a function which is an effective acceleration, which depends on the forces. The forces are the derivative of these fields respect to x, and that can be computed exactly like similar to the effective velocity that in the system. However, we ask ourselves, like, what about diffusive corrections? And diffusive correction to this equation are important because, as hopefully you can show, they're responsible for basically the late time dynamics that you have in the system, which is thermalization. Because this system now are not anymore integrable. So in a sense, we expect the dynamics to be much more generic, namely a late time, they should show some relaxation to standard Gibbs ensemble, where basically only few chemical potentials are present. So what one has to do, I'll go a bit faster now. What one has to do basically is to do some kind of local perturbation theory, because now now Hamiltonian is at each position in our fluid cell is given by a flat part, namely a part given by the sum of all these conserved quantities taken exactly at this position. So now you can think this as some global Hamiltonian in the fluid cell, but with the correction, which is basically given by the force. The force is basically the linear slope of these external fields at each fluid cell. This correction can be taken into account by doing some perturbation theory, namely the evolution of any operator locally in each fluid cell is given by the evolution given by this Hamiltonian, this global Hamiltonian at each position x, plus a terms that's proportional to the force, the linear slope. And we can run all the same machinery that we run for the diffusion. Turn out that in order to well write down the hydrodynamic equation for such a system, we have to extend the space of our currents. Namely, of course, we know that the current, what we call usually hydrodynamic current, is the one induced by the flow of Hamiltonian. It's if you have some density, this will flow due to the presence of the evolution of the Hamiltonian. But this is just one current we can consider. We can consider the current induced by the flow of any of our conserved quantity in a system. And we denote this by this, JKI, namely is the current induced by the flow of the quantity K on the charge I. And it turned out that if we extend our space of our current to this, we have some very condensed expression for our hydrodynamic equation. We can introduce some extended Gonzaga coefficients, basically where we have a current induced by any charge respect to any quantity. And basically the equation that we find at the second order for this setting is this, which, okay, looks a bit monstrous, but let's analyze it a bit. I don't know why it's doing this. Okay, so we have another dynamic equation with where the time dependent of the conserved quantities is there is still some current induced by the fact that we have locally we have an homogeneous Hamiltonian, so this induces some flow in our system. There is an acceleration due to the fact that we have forces locally in our system, and then there are again the second order term, the diffusive terms, and this diffusive term basically we have diffusive spreading of the current locally due to the spatial imbalance of chemical potential. We have diffusion spreading of the acceleration, which also, in a sense, undergoes diffusion due to the Hamiltonian evolution. But also we have a diffusion spreading of the local current and of forces due to the forces. Namely, the forces also induce some diffusion spreading. And these are two terms that usually you would not see if you just would think naively. Like if you just would say, okay, I take another dynamic equation, I had forces, and then I just put diffusion. Then naively, you would just add these two terms. But actually, if you do calculation correctly, you also find out that there are these two strange terms that if you don't put there, basically you lose positive entropy production. And indeed, what okay, I should show later. What one can check is that if you compute the hydrodynamic entropy of the fluid cell, maybe the total entropy of our hydrodynamic system, you have a positive time entropy increase as it should, and this positive quantity is exactly given by the sum of all these four generalized Gonzaga coefficients. That's taken all the sum gives a bilinear form that indeed can be proven to be positive. And this is, of course, what one should expect, that entropy increase is positive. And this is indeed what diffusion usually leads to a positive entropy increase. Here, we can also check that basically the only stationary state of this dynamic equation are thermal states. Thermal states, it means that there is some effective temperature associated to the to our fields. Of course, we are thermal locally because we have an Hamiltonian which depend on space. It means that basically our temperature depends on space, but only with the global temperature coefficient. And we can also add, if you want, this is going to be some grand canonical ensemble. Grand canonical in the sense we can conserve what are called ultralocal and ultralocal charges. Namely, for example, like the density of particle also will be will be one external chemical potential that we have in our thermal states. But the point is that the only stationary states, if we also include the Euler type evolution, will be with constant chemical potential. So basically, at late time, there will be only 2 or 3 chemical potential that are flat, and this will be the stationary state. So this, in a sense, answers like the question of what happened to in fluid, which is like almost integrable, but with some external modulation. Like if you want back to the question of quantum Newton cradle, if we thermalize at late time, yes, it does thermalize, and the thermalization is induced by basically the diffusion rearrangements that we have in our system due to the fact the system is interacting.
Jacopo, one question.
Yes.
What is this scriptal operator? How is that defined?
Yes. So basically, I was skipping this. There are basically 2 different types of conserved quantity that allows to some simplification in these Onsager coefficients. We have self-conserved charges, basically whenever their current is conserved under any flow. And we have ultralocal charges when basically the charges do not evolve under any flow. And example, like for example, the density, if you take Liebling and you take the density of particle, this is a self-conserved charge. Basically, its current does not evolve to anything. It's the momentum. The momentum of the density is the current of the density is momentum and doesn't evolve. It's a conserved quantity. And ultralocal charges are basically when they don't induce any flow. So basically, these are operators that do not induce any flow, so they're simpler in a sense. And these are all operators we are the only conserved quantity that we are allowed to put in our late time Gibbs state. But if you want, it's very intuitively, it's just that the thermal states will be some grand canonical where you conserve also a set of chemical potential associated either to the density or to, I don't know, total electric charge, something like this. Okay, so how much time do I have?
So for 40 minutes past, so you have 30 minutes.
I have 15 minutes? No.
No, 40 minutes past already. So you have another 30 minutes.
I should conclude.
No. You have another 10 minutes for talk, and after that you have 20 minutes for discussion.
Okay. So I will, as basically now. Okay, let me just finish this technical part, and then we will stick to an example. As I showed before, in integrable system, again, this equation that I wrote here, it's a generic equation. It's a generic hydrodynamic equation. Actually, when we were asking ourselves what's the hydrodynamic equation with force terms and diffusive correction, generic, we were a bit surprised to not find this result in the literature, because people are studying hydrodynamics since hundreds of years. Maybe we did not find it. Maybe it's written in some book. But so we rederived this equation, and maybe it's indeed written somewhere. So in a sense, it's a generic equation. The new aspect is basically to restrict it maybe to integrable system, and again go to this quasi-particle basis I talked about. So basically we have an extended generalized hydrodynamic equation which now describe the effect of external forces and diffusion spreading in the system. So the first part is the one I showed you before. It's the Euler equation. It's an equation where there is convective spreading of quasi-particles with acceleration terms. So this is just the Euler equation. The right-hand side is indeed all caused by diffusion spreading. And there are like 3 effective diffusion coefficients now. So before I only show you this part, and indeed that's what you get if I set our forces to 0. If there is no acceleration, there is no this part. But if as soon as I force this, I have extra 2 diffusion coefficients, which are all positive definites. And in a sense, what is interesting is that basically now the dynamics of the quasi-particles, that they all flow into the system. They are accelerated, but they also diffuse both in real and in momentum, quasi-momentum space. So this is like a bilinear diffusion either in x and theta. So if you want, this is the order 1 over x squared, this is order x theta, this is theta x, and this is theta squared. So it's a bilinear form for diffusion in real space and momentum space. So in a sense, this is interesting because it kind of show you that GHD, it's not, despite the fact that it's a Radamic equation for a 1 + 1 dimension, is actually the equation for like quasi 2-dimensional fluids. And this indeed opened the setting for a lot of different questions that should be replied. But okay, so also the entropy increase can be written as a bilinear form in that you can see, like there is a spreading for the filling of this quasi-particle, there is a spreading in real space and in quasi-momentum space, and is set by these diffusion coefficients. And we have not had much time to analyze these equations so far, and this will be like maybe the setting for the future. I will now restrict to a simpler case, which is in a sense the most interesting for experiments. And I will go back to our Lieb-Lininger model. So there is a class of, as I said before, there is a class of external fields that allow for simplification in this equation. Basically, all these terms go to 0. And because in the case that my external potential is just a coupling to a self-conserved charge, not like the density in a Galilean system. So for any Galilean system like a Lieb-Lininger, if I add a density modulation, basically I get an equation which is very simple. It's just a Euler equation with acceleration and just the standard diffusion terms. So this is also like why we were confused. If you like open your Wikipedia page on Navier-Stokes equation, indeed, this is exactly what you find. You can find an equation for a fluid with viscosity and external forces. But usually these external forces, at least you see, the simplest one are like just forces coupling to density, like acceleration force. And this, that's basically the usual Navier-Stokes equation. You have some forces with some diffusion. This, as I show you, the reality is much different if you have forces coupling to charges that are not self-conserved, like, for example, and then energy or spin and so on. But nevertheless, okay, we are going back to Lieb-Lininger and trying to understand, if you want, the old problem 2006 of a quantum Newton cradle. What happens if I have a system of boson interacting with point contacts, but I also put them in some harmonic trap? So there is an harmonic trap, this term. And should I see thermalization at large time or not? And now we can run this equation. And I already show you, this equation shows positive entropy increase and entropy increase until the point that you reach stationary state. And the stationary state actually has to be the thermal state. So in a sense, we already know the answer. The answer is that yes, the gas will, at least hydrodynamic predicts that the gas will thermalize. So in order to see the physics, we did a numerical experiment. Namely, you prepare your gas with some potential V of x, and then you just shift it. For example, we take some periodic boundary condition on a circle of size L, and you initialize your gas in the thermal regime of this potential, and then you just flip the potential and see what happened. And what you see is indeed that if you look, for example, at the evolution of some local operator, so for example, this is the density square of your bosons, basically you see that there is some fast relaxation towards some steady value. And this steady value, it's really induced by the rapid Eulerian evolution. Namely, if you go back to this equation, basically, you can basically forget initial time about the presence of diffusion. You can only take this Euler equation, and this will give you this steady state that you see for times of order of L. L is the system size. However, if you wait long enough, if you go to times of order L square, these terms start to play a role. Namely, particles start to rearrange in a momentum and real space. And you see basically a thermalization to the thermal value. So this dashed line is the thermal value, which indeed you see that is far from it at times of order L. And so here indeed we did for different L, and you see a perfectly scaling as L square. You see the same for the entropy. The entropy, indeed, if you choose a higher value of L, the entropy still increase at order T over L. So the entropy increase is always order L. In a sense, the Euler, there is still an entropy increase due to the fact that you have a Eulerian evolution and diffusion, but the real one, the one that really brings you to the thermal value, is on order L square. And if you want, you can also see in this density plot, this is basically the density of quasi-particle in X and theta space. And you should, and this helps to really to build an intuition, because as I said, this is like almost like a two-dimensional fluid, and when it's evolving, it's creating a bunch of fine structures like these wiggles that you see here. This is a time order L, and but if you wait long enough, then all this wiggle will have to diffuse and basically thermalize to like some kind of more continuous blob. And this is exactly what diffusion does. Basically, is a coarse grain our fine structure, and only after that you have coarse grain, you can see thermalization. Then we also did more like experimental setting. Like, for example, you can initialize your gas in some double well potentials and then let it go as the Newton cradle experiment. And indeed, when you do this kind of non-equilibrium setting, you see a lot of oscillations of your clouds. As you can see here, this is a plot of the density of the gas as a function of time. You see that it oscillates back and forth many times. And but eventually, indeed, or at a time order of 50 oscillations, then you reach the thermal value for the, for example, for the entropy, but also for the profile of local observables. So instead, of course, here we put ourselves in a condition of coupling and density, where thermalization is quite fast, and by fast still means that it has to take order 100 of oscillation for this object to thermalize. But in the experiments, actually, it could also take longer because of different coupling. But the only argument is, but the main argument stay the same, that a one-dimensional gas of bosons, if you add a standard potential, will eventually thermalize due to this, to the presence of diffusion in its own hydrodynamics that makes the system to relax. And in order to check if this had anything to do with the reality, we also did the numerical experiments, like numerical simulation. And for the numerical simulation, of course, it's quite hard. It's impossible, basically, to simulate a continuous quantum system to very large time. So what one relies to is in the semi-classical limit, namely taking this very small coupling, but with a very high temperature. Then this field becomes effectively classical field, and then you can run a classical numerical simulation. And so here the the dots are indeed the classical simulation, and this for some observable, like the density of bosons at different positions in our system. And we again see like some kind of steady relaxation to some value which is far from the thermal value for each position. These are different positions in our system, but nevertheless, a very large time of order 100, we can see a flow of the system of each value towards its thermal value, correctly predict by its own hydrodynamic. Then, okay, just to finish, recently we also tried the Toda Gas. So Toda is a classical system for interacting molecules, if you want. They interact with the potential, which is exponentially decreasing in the distance. If you take, if this potential is constant, then this is the usual Toda classical gas, which is an integrable system. Now we modulate this potential with some with this Hamiltonian with some potential. Basically, we are doing exactly inhomogeneous Hamiltonian. We are coupling now to the energy, the external field coupled to the energy. So we have a force in the energy, and indeed, by doing numerical simulation, we can see that there is the emergence of one single global temperature, which can be actually measured by measuring the momenta of all these particles that coincide with the temperature predicted basically by doing a local density approximation. So here we haven't checked that this figure actually, this thermalization is reproduced by the generalized dynamic prediction, because running this generalized dynamic equation for the case of external density, for the energy force is quite complicated, still working on it. But at least we checked that the prediction is correct, that indeed the external field, in this case coupling to energy, bring the system to thermalize at large time. And okay, so I think I'm ready to conclude. So basically, what did I give? So somehow this could be known or not known before. Actually, to the best of my knowledge and our knowledge, we didn't find a place where it was basically derived how to do the so-called hydrodynamic expansion. So we gave some kind of way to understand the logic behind the hydrodynamic expansion, namely take an hydrodynamic state and start to expand the chemical potential in a different power of the slope. And from this, we understand from where the diffusive terms in the hydrodynamic come from. And this is basically that it proved to be fundamental to understand how to add diffusive terms to inhomogeneous Hamiltonian, because although the problem seems quite standard, how to derive diffusive hydrodynamic of inhomogeneous Hamiltonian, we could not find an answer. So this helped a lot. What are the main physical conclusions? The main physical conclusion that is, if you take an Hamiltonian which is integrable, but you add forces, no matter to which density they couple, the late time will always relax to some thermal stationary state, which in a sense answer an old question starting from the quantum Newton cradle. And I find particularly fascinating is that thermalization really, in a sense, is it's explained in the same way you would explain the thermalization of a normal fluid. It's really without the viscosity, if you don't include the viscosity, you will not see thermalization. You will just go to see some steady state which is not thermal. It's really the viscosity terms in the system that are basically there because the system is interacting that are responsible for thermalization. And also the reason why you see thermalization on such long scales, because in this system, viscosities are quite small. So in the time scales, you really have to go to time scales of order L square, or of order, if you want, spatial modulation to the second power. So there are many questions that open up due to this. For example, as somebody was asking in the audience, can we go to a higher order in this hydrodynamic expansion? What the kind of hydrodynamic you get at higher order? And but also like basically all questions coming from this generalized dynamic equation with force and diffusion that needs to be analyzed. Can we see different relaxation behaviors depending on the type of inhomogeneous Hamiltonian that one can choose? For example, for the Liebling coupling to density, we saw this relaxation order L square, but can we see, for example, different type of relaxation depending on the Stellar field? And with this, I'm done. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and nice talk, beautiful talk. So the session is open for questions and comments. Yeah. So do you have any comments from audience? If you have a question, raise your hand, and I call your name. I call the name. Okay, so please.
Hi, Jacopo. Thanks for the talk. So there is this one aspect of this argument that I've not really understood, is why it's okay to assume that rho p is well defined up to this late time. Because, you know, it seems to me in some way this is an upper bound on the time to thermalization, because it's possible that rho p actually stops being well defined before then because of your beta ansatz, for example, stops being meaningful. So could you comment on that at all?
Yes, so that's yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, indeed, like this, basically the way you, okay, we don't even have to talk about rho p because it's a bit misleading. So the equation, the hydrodynamic equation that you have is this one, and it's an equation for all the conserved quantities, I mean, for all the density of conserved quantities that you have in your system.
Yeah,
and,
but isn't the number of those different at the beginning and end of the evolution? I mean,
yes, indeed, it's true. But indeed, this equation does not conserve anything except total energy and ultra-local charges. So in a sense, and that's the reason why you relax to a thermal state. But in a sense, yes, basically the main ingredient that you have put inside in order to take into account the forces is perturbation theory. So in a sense, what I said before is that basically the way you derive this hydrodynamic equation is by taking in each fluid cell, you take an homogeneous Hamiltonian plus the effect of the forces. So you have to take hydrodynamic theory. You have to do first order perturbation theory on the fluid cell, which of course in some cases it may fail at large time. Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Usually you should see some divergences, right? You should see some weird divergences. At least in the case of like, for example, the Liebling, you don't see this divergence, and it seems to work well with at least with the classical experiment. But I agree. I mean, it's a question of knowing what's the validity in time of this equation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is that something you've thought about from a non-hydrodynamic viewpoint at all, or you're?
No, I don't know. I think what one should do is really to take this equation and check it. But I tend to think that as long as all these coefficients have a finite large time limits, it should work. But I agree, there is checks to be done. Yes.
Well, can you try it for hard rods where that breakdown time is known, or is that
yes? So yes, I know why you're asking this. I tend to think that for hard rod it should work, but because in a sense it's the same hard rod, it's like Liebling kind of worked, but it always depends on the setting. To me, this should still describe some average in space evolution, and should predict anyway thermalization. But if we predict in all cases, if predict the correct time scale, this is a question to be proved.
Thank you.
Okay, so Abhishek.
Yeah, so a question sort of related to what we've asked. Alternatively, in this system, one could have started by looking at the two conserved quantities, the density and the energy, and try to derive a hydrodynamic description, right? And I think this is done in some classical systems. That's what's done. So, can't one do the same thing here?
Yeah, if you if you know some references, I would be happy to check. So what I could not find really, it's basically I like to have an hydrodynamic equation where basically diffusion is all expressed in terms of some kind of Onsager matrix, and I could not find such an equation if I add external forces and forces that couple to generic, for example, force coupling to energy or something like this. But I'm happy to discuss if you know some references and see indeed how does apply to, how does it restrict, if we should have found the same as some people have found before, but
okay. So you're saying in this case the diffusion coefficient is known from microscopics, which is not the case if you do the other approach.
What do you mean not from microscopic?
In this case, like it in terms of like a Green-Kubo relation, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right,
yes,
okay.
Indeed, it's not enough, right? If you add forces, the diffusion coefficient is not just the one you obtain from standard Green-Kubo. Namely, these are all, if you want, obtained by some kind of a Green-Kubo formula, but it's not enough to just consider, for example, the current induced by Hamiltonian. You also have to add other diffusion coefficients that are, for example, the current induced by the thermostates on the forces. And so it's really not naive. Let's put it like that. These terms are really not naive. They're not just, you don't just see them by following Green-Kubo receipt, at least.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so next, Das. Please, Shankar.
Yes.
Das.
About this collective modes, do you have a single particle mode similarly, equations for single particle modes? Like self-diffusion. I mean, the diffusion that you are talking about is some kind of collective diffusion, I presume, of density fluctuations. But if you have single particle diffusion, would there be corresponding equations like this for that? In classical hydrodynamics, there is.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit. I'm just not sure what it means. Single particle or higher particle diffusion.
I mean, there is collective density fluctuations, or you can think of single particle density fluctuation.
Yeah. So the diffusion here, it's caused by density fluctuation. Yes.
Collective density fluctuations.
Yes, collectively, because in a sense these quasi-particles are not local. There's some quasi-local objects, but in terms of the quasi-particle, these are basically diffusion is just due to the fluctuation of their density, but these are not exactly local objects.
But would you have something like a single particle diffusion in this kind of system? Can you think of a hydrodynamic mode for that? Like in a classical system, you have a tagged particle diffusion.
I don't know. I'm not sure how to.
The other question is the momentum is not conserved, right? Maybe you have said it, I missed it. in this system, momentum is not conserved. You talk about, I heard energy and density, but there was no momentum conservation involved. Because then in classical hydrodynamics, those equations get very much changed. You get density fluctuations, collective density fluctuations, diffusion only when you play with the momentum conservation law in a certain way. Otherwise, it would be more complicated.
So,
but in this formalism that you have presented, momentum, where is the momentum conservation equation?
There is momentum conservation if you apply this formula to Galilean system. Like, for example, hard rods or Lieb-Lininger all have these are Galilean system, and they have momentum conservation, and basically one of these QI will mean momentum, and indeed it will have no diffusion because sorry, the density in that case the density will have no diffusion exactly.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the self-conserved charge that I was talking about, that is current, is conserved quantity, and therefore shows no diffusion. But nevertheless, here, because you have a tower of higher conserved quantities, that doesn't simplify much the problem, because anyway, all the other conserved quantities do have diffusion because they're not self-conserved. So, but yes, you can consider a system with conserved momentum here, no problems.
Thank you.
Okay, so is there any other question? Oh, okay. Rahu down the car. So please.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I wanted to ask if, so basically, in the Lieb-Lininger model, if I understand correctly, the extra diffusion terms that you have for F, which come from, d theta, they don't come, right? There's only one diffusion term in the Lieb-Lininger.
Yeah. Well, I mean, only if your external force coupled to the density of particles.
But then what breaks the integrability when I'm looking, so when I'm looking at the diffusion equation, it's not obvious to me why it's an equation for a non-integrable system.
Yes, very good. Yeah, so basically, indeed, in this case, the question that you have is this one. And and you can check that this equation only conserve energy and total energy and total density, and all other basically all other momenta of this density are not conserved. This is not a mathematical statement. In a sense, that's what we could do. I don't exclude that there could be like some less local quantity still conserved by this equation, but so far what the statement is this. But a simple check can just show you that all the higher conserved quantities are broken except energy and density by this equation.
Okay, but yeah, because that was my confusion, because you said that the non-integrability comes from the extra diffusion terms, sort of. Those are what create the extra, energy, entropy production.
Yeah.
Right? Which is not there in this case.
Yeah. So very good. No, it's this one. This is I agree that this case is so simple that it's a bit counterintuitive. But in this case, these extra terms are zero, but it's a bit like they were there. But integrability is basically broken by the interplay between diffusion and acceleration. So if I would not have acceleration, this would be a perfectly integrable system, because you see every term will be a gradient. So any integral of respect to x of this would be conserved quantity. But because I have acceleration, like this term, I'm basically breaking integrability. And in this case, it's enough, because of the specific coupling, it's enough just to have these two terms to break it in a way that entropy is positively increasing.
So I just wanted to clarify, just is it possible that this system is still integrable? It's just that you're looking at local quantities, so it looks non-integrable?
Is it possible that the system, you mean?
There are still non-local conserved quantities which you're not considering.
Yes, I cannot exclude it. I cannot
Okay.
exclude it. But from the, I agree. I'm doing hydrodynamics, which of course it neglects something, and all I can claim is that from a dynamic point of view, I see only conservation energy, and that's therefore I see thermalization to a grand canonical ensemble. But I mean standard grand canonical ensemble. But yes, if this is correctly what the macroscopic theory is doing, it's hard. It's I mean, almost impossible to prove. I can only do numerical simulation and check.
Thank you.
Okay, so do you have a question?
3B.
Yeah, hi, Jacopo.
Oh,
It's
yes,
a very
this is the last
nice
question. Okay.
Yeah,
Please.
Jacopo, it's a very illuminating talk. So I have two questions which are related to each other. So when you talk about the thermalization, so usually thermalization would be for the whole distribution of these densities. But here the equation that you're writing, they're deterministic hydrodynamic equations. You are getting some kind of the average behavior of the, like it's the density profile, not their stationary distribution or the probability of seeing different density profiles.
No,
No.
let me stop you. This equation is not time reversible. The moment I add diffusion, it breaks time reversibility. If I only would write a Euler equation, indeed, this would be time reversible, and I would see no stationarity. But with the addition of diffusive terms, you break this.
No, that's perfectly fine. So it will reach, so your entropic, this increase will say that there is a stationary state which has a particular value of the density. But in the stationary state, your different density profiles have a distribution. And that distribution decides whether it is equilibrium or non-equilibrium, right? So your hydrodynamics doesn't give that distribution of different density profiles in the stationary state. Am I correct?
No, it does, right? I mean, it's a distribution of thermal. You know how to write down the thermal distribution, but in a sense, yes. Yeah. If like set this to 0 and you solve this, what you should find is really the density as a function of theta and x and t, the stationary density.
Yeah, you get the stationary density, but not, so it's the stationary most probable density, but not the fluctuations. So the reason I'm asking the question, because in the classical systems, where you have an additional noise term, and when you say that it really thermalizes or reaches, you say that the stationary distribution is like Maxwell-Boltzmann or Gibbs distribution.
I see.
So also the reason I asked this question, because the Lieb-Liniger gas also related to the Brownian with hardcore interaction. So like the delta Bose gas, you could relate to Brownian with non-crossing interactions. So for which in the classical side, you can actually do hydrodynamics with fluctuations. So I was wondering whether in your approach, is there a way that you could add fluctuating parts? And
yeah, that's a very good question. I think Takato Yoshimura will talk a bit about this. There is indeed undergoing research on how to do like classical, for example, fluctuating theory of GHT. But in general, I don't know exactly what Takato will talk about, but in general, yes, it's a question how to extend this formalism to add fluctuations. It's not yet clear, but
okay, thanks.
Okay, so time is up. So I'd like to close the first talk. So thank you for a nice, beautiful talk.
Thanks a lot for your great questions.